Oh my. There are some huge differences in where we're seeing players get drafted on sites like ESPN and Yahoo versus what we're used to seeing in best ball on sites like DraftKings and Underdog. While you may or may not play best ball, it's still very important to understand this information because it can be a significant edge for you in your fantasy league. First of all, we're talking about data that's not based on mock drafts, where we know half the people drop out by round 9 and it's not that strong. This is actually based on thousands and thousands of drafts where people have put their hard-earned money on the line. Additionally, best ball drafters are hardcore fantasy football players. I mean, you have to be to start drafting in May for a season that's not going to begin for multiple months. This is a group of people that are very tuned in to macro strategies. They're well read and they understand player trends and all of the latest news. That's not a bad place to crowdsource from. So today, we're going to focus on players going at least 24 picks earlier in best ball. We want to know who are those potential steals we should be targeting, and we'll stop and think about how that impacts our draft strategy. The first player we're going to talk about is Calvin Ridley. He has been steaming up draft boards on DraftKings and Underdog, where he is a round 2 and early round 3 pick, respectively. Yet when we look at ESPN, he's a round 5 selection and he's a late round 4 pick on Yahoo. The last time we saw Calvin Ridley for a full season, he averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game. That was the number 4 finisher in 2020. And while it's true he's been away from the game for a while, he's going to knock off all that rust getting a full training camp. He's still in his prime, and even though in 2021, when he started those first 6 games for the Falcons, he wasn't a great fantasy producer, he still had a 26% targets per route run, which is still wide receiver 1 worthy. We're talking about a wide receiver with number 1 upside, and you're getting him in rounds 4 and 5. That is an absolute steal. The second player we're going to discuss is Christian Watson. He's a round 4 pick right now in best ball, but if you look at ESPN, he falls to round 6, and on Yahoo, that goes all the way down to round 8. Watson battled injuries early in his rookie season. However, in week 10, he took over with a full-time role, and from that point on, he continued to shred opposing defenses, despite the fact that he's really the only thing the Packers had in the passing game. He averaged 17.2 fantasy points per game over that final stretch, and if that's not enough for you, the underlying data screams the same thing: a 23% target share and a 41% air yard share. When we look at those two data points, they correlate very strongly to future fantasy success, and they're predictive year over year. That means Christian Watson is absolutely someone we should be looking to smash the draft button on later in drafts on Yahoo and ESPN. Our third name is Mike Williams with the Chargers, and best ball drafters, they are willing to pick up the tab on his round 4 cost. However, on ESPN and Yahoo, we're talking about a player that consistently falls into round 7 of drafts. Williams doesn't have that high-end target earning profile. He's more of an 18 to 20% type guy. But guess what? That is enough when you consider the fact that he's going to play in one of the most pass-friendly offenses in the NFL. In fact, if I had to mortgage my house and make a bet on which team is going to throw the ball the absolute most in 2023, my bet would be on the Chargers. And while that passing volume is really nice, we know not all passing attempts are created equal. Some teams trail all of the time, and then the defense knows they're going to be throwing the ball, and that can bring efficiency down. With the Chargers, it's just in their DNA, and a big part of that is because they have Justin Herbert, a young, ascending quarterback. And when you add all of that up, you've got a big play talent, high volume offense with one of the best young quarterbacks in the NFL. That is a value we should be willing to go after in round 7. That brings us to our 4th wide receiver, Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers, a guy that I've been very high on all offseason. but it's being backed up by this best ball ADP, where he goes in round 5 on DraftKings and on Underdog, yet on ESPN and Yahoo, he's falling to round 7. Johnson has delivered 141, 166, and 139 targets over the last 3 seasons. You can't demand 25 and 27% target shares without being a really good wide receiver. Now, Johnson was really unlucky in the touchdown department last season. Despite all of those targets, he wasn't able to turn them into scores, and that really held down his fantasy production. However, if we look historically at wide receivers that have averaged in the target ranges he's had, they score 5 to 7 per season, and that also lines up with the 2 previous years before last when Johnson scored 7 and 8. When we have an opportunity to roster an elite target earning player like Deontay Johnson, we just can't say no in round 7. I know it may seem weird, but he really does carry high-end wide receiver 2 upside. In fact, as recently as 2 seasons ago, we saw Johnson finish as a wide receiver 1. Now, while I've outlined some of the top guys I wanted to make sure you're thinking about in your drafts, this list continues on, and it's mostly wide receivers. Listen to some of these names that are going 24 picks or more earlier in best ball. You've got Drake London, Jerry Jeudy, Christian Kirk, Jahan Dotson, Gabriel Davis, Treylon Burks. The list goes on and on and on, and it's all about the wide receivers. Now, there is a caveat with this data, and it really starts with the fact that you have to start 3 wide receivers on DraftKings and Underdog. When we look at the base settings for ESPN and Yahoo, it's 2 wide receivers plus a flex. We do have a flex in best ball as well, but that does create a slight difference in supply and demand, which can lead to wide receivers going a little bit later. However, I would argue that best ball drafters are also just very sharp. They understand how good wide receivers have been against running backs over the last 12 years. In fact, in PPR formats, the top 12 scorers, when you put running backs and wide receivers together, 57% of them have been wide receivers over the last 12 years. Only 38% have been running backs. And that trend continues across every bucket. If you want to cut it 13 to 24, 25 to 36, all the way out to the top 120, wide receivers have scored more points than running backs. So let's take a little bit of a step back here and zoom out and think about what we've learned and how can we apply that to helping us be better in fantasy football and winning our drafts. Well, we know that running backs are going earlier when we talk about the drafts happening on Yahoo and ESPN versus best ball. Wide receivers are going later. So that's creating a value pocket that we don't see in best ball. When you're drafting over with Underdog and on DraftKings, if you pass wide receivers early to take a good running back, it can be really brutal because your league mates don't stop. They will continue taking the wide receivers. What we're seeing over on the other platforms is if you take the running backs early, they're not staying on the wide receivers, and you're still going to have an opportunity to draft some really good wide receivers in those middle rounds. And it's not only the middle rounds. We are seeing the wide receiver value continue into the later rounds. And that's where we can talk about the rookie wide receivers. On best ball, the drafters are much more willing to take them by round 7. When we move over to ESPN and Yahoo, these are guys that are falling into rounds 9 and 10 of your draft. And we know rookie wide receivers have been a cheat code late in seasons, especially these guys that have that first round capital. And we know there's a potential for them to flash big talent late in the season. Of course, even after the rookies are gone, we have options on players like Nico Collins, Elijah Moore, now playing with Deshaun Watson. And those guys are going in rounds 12 and 13, which brings me to another really important point. If you're in a league that plays a kicker and a defense, and you have to draft them, if you don't draft them. Take additional players by all means, but let's assume you have to draft them. Don't take them until your last 2 picks. There's just too much value on the board. You could hit an absolute home run on a player like Elijah Moore in round 13, and that's going to be a lot more valuable than trying to take a defense a little bit earlier than your league mates, because that's a position that's really unpredictable, and we can almost always find something off of the waiver wire. So that's it for this video. I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I would love to see some screenshots of some of these drafts where I know you're going to go out and dominate. Just hit me at Dwayne McFarland, DWAIN McFarland over on Twitter, or as we call it now, X. Good luck, everybody.